Hi, this is Adibi Praise from History 1305, Monday and Wednesday, 1 p.m. through 2:15. Myself, I'm a group 3. We're talking about chapter 3, creating new social order, and I'll be starting with mobility. During the 1500s, Spain expanded its colonial empire to the Philippines in the Far East and to the areas in the Americas that later became the United States. Spain also gained a foothold in present day Florida, viewing that every area and lands to the north as a logical extension to the Caribbean Empire. In 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon had claimed the area around today's extension as well from St. Augustine for the Spanish crown. Also, in 1610, Spanish settlers established themselves at Santa Fe, which was originally named La Villarreal de la Santa Fe de San Francisco de Assis, or in English known as Royal City of the Holy Faith of St. Francis of Assisi, where many Pueblo villages were located. Santa Fe became the capital of the Kingdom of New Mexico, an outpost of the larger Spanish Viceroyalty of New Spain, which had its headquarters in New Mexico, in Mexico City. The native people of Florida, whom the Spanish displaced with the founding of St. Augustine, the first Spanish settlement in North America. Lastly, Lastly, St. Augustine for the Spanish crown, naming the land Pascua, Florida, for the nearest feast day. Ponce de Leon was unable to establish a permanent settlement there, but by 1565, Spain was in need of an outpost to confront the French and English privateers using Florida as a base.
The introduction of diseases in New Spain. One of the greatest impacts in the European colonization is the spread of diseases. Everywhere the Spanish, they brought devastating diseases which the neighbor had no immunity to, which led to a decrease in the population. In the 1630s, half of the Huron and the Iroquois around the Great Lakes died of smallpox. The very young and the very old were the most vulnerable and had the highest mortality rates. The diseases came through trade mostly.
In capitalism, it was mostly incorporated through trade in the beginning, from trading in the Dutch Republic to the natives, establishing themselves as a major commercial center in the Manhattan Island. The connections with the natives allowed them to trade for guns, blankets, and alcohol with the neighboring natives. Not only was there trading with the natives, but also as well as a slave trade. The high demand for labor to grow cash crops in the New World implemented the necessity for manpower, for the sugar and tobacco being the main cash crops. Colonization of the New Netherland. The cost of colonization was increasing by the minute, and in terms had low numbers in colonization because nobody wanted to come to the New World. That being said, the patroon ships played a huge part in granting Dutch merchants large pieces of land. In return, the merchants would have to pay for a minimum amount of 30 Dutch farmers and their passage to the New World. Through the development of the tobacco company brought economic stability, labor demanding caused a spark in indentured servants being used to carry the crops as well as maintain them. Indentured servants being the opportunity to rise in the social rankings of the social class. Often worked 5 to 7 years, and in some occasions, in return for their service, the servants would receive the 50 acres of land.
When Europeans began to colonize America, they changed the continent because they brought goods, ideas, and diseases. Slaves at the time were in very high demand for labor because of the New World cash crops such as sugar and tobacco. Slaves were traded between Europeans and African Americans in West Africa. Slaves were traded for European textiles, alcohol, guns, tobacco, and food. Africans began taxing slave purchases as well, changing. Europeans introduced goods such as copper, kettles, glass beads, and metal utensils. These goods gave rise to new artistic objects such as shell beads. These shell beads were used in ceremonies as jewelry and currency. The metals and weapons Europeans brought over also influenced native groups and helped them gain an upper hand on their enemies. Diseases such as smallpox killed thousands of native populations.
Yeah, and give them.
Diseases prevented capitalism increasing due to the high death rates that were created in the New World, until things like patroonships brought incentives as a way to rise in social hierarchy that was established in Europe.
Democracy, hey! I'm gonna cover something like democracy and the absence of democracy in different colonies, like New Spain, New France, New Netherlands, New England. Wow, that's a lot of new, hey. And how colony trade the natives, how they trade the slaves, how they trade their colonizer, and the differences rise between men and women. Okay, I'm gonna start with New Spain. New Spain is under a system called a patriarchy, where society system that men hold the primary power and predominate their role in political leadership and the control of the property. So which means women have a fewer right and occupied a lower status. Spanish colonies also under a system called Endomediate system. Under this system, authorized was assigned Indian worker to mine and plantation, which with understanding that they have to teach them Spanish and turn them to Christian. But in reality, there were nothing different than slaves. Natives was being forced to mine with very little food, and if they were resized, they would get a harsh punishment. And the system was ends up replaced by Repomediate system, and the system required Indian towns to supply pool of laborers to the Spanish overlord. Spanish also forced a group of natives called Timucua, who was died out in large number because the disease from Spanish people was left over, and converted them to Catholicism. Spanish gave them no rights to natives and treated them nothing different like slaves. This is the absence of democracy in New Spain. Then New Netherlands and New France. Hey, they're a little bit better than New Spain. In New France, the colonizers were special the natives to convert them to Christian, but they never see them equally. Hey, but at least they're trying to communicate with the natives. Hey, that's pretty good. They're also under a system called patroonship. Patroonship requires the shareholder to pay for the passage to the new world for at least 30 farmers. There had a little democracy in New Netherlands and New France. Even they still treat the native terribly, but at least they give them own colonizer and farmers their rights. Now is New England, which is pretty different, depends on the colony. In Massachusetts, they set up the government as religions come first, which means the church have the most power. The individuals don't have much rights and live under a hard laws. But in Virginia, the government was being decided before they come to the New World. The government was being set up with a governor, a council, and the House of Burgesses. But in New England, there is indentured services. Indentured servants allowed poor people to get passed to American with food, clothes. In return, they have to work for several years in the colony. People under indentured services system, they don't have much rights. They could not marry. They were subject to will of tobacco planters, and if they commit a crime, their master have the rights to lengthen their service years. They treat them nothing different than slave. Master will try to work them hard as they can, and they also can sell them just like slaves. New England is a colony between democracy and the absence of democracy, especially in Virginia. They will give them rights to the free people and democracy way to set up the government, but they use poor people just like slaves.
Basically, to reiterate what the democracy slide had said, men and women were not equal within the Spanish society. Men had rule over politics and women had a lower status, but they believed that if you weren't Spanish, then you were inferior to them. And Native Americans were exploited because they would use them to convert them to Catholicism and use them to mine and do labor work, while the plantation owners, with the understanding, would just only defend the colony and teach the workers the tenets of Christianity. Spanish had displaced the local Timucua Indians from their ancient town of Siloy, and the Catholic priests forced Timucua Indians to convert after larger numbers of losses of family. French had relied on Native American people to harvest the pelts that proved profitable in Europe. So, as seen throughout history, many of African Americans and Native Indians were used only for labor and for profit.